my students. I'm so excited to start reading the book Educated with you today. I think you guys are going to love this book, and we just could not have timed it more perfectly. There's so much going on in the world right now that is relevant to this book, and I can't wait to talk about it with you guys. Last time we had a sub, I don't know if you remember, and you guys answered some anticipation questions about this book. Questions about things like, how do your parents' choices influence you, and what kinds of sacrifices have you made to gain an education, and do you think that it's important to preserve a good relationship with your family no matter what? I'm trying to think what else. How do you know when somebody's trustworthy? What does it mean to be educated? These are all questions that I want you to think about throughout the entire book. So keep these questions in the back of your mind. We're going to revisit them. And remember, we're going to use this guiding quote about the book as we read. It's, "Everything I had worked for, all my years of study, had been to purchase for myself this one privilege, to see and experience more truths than those given to me by my Father, and to use those truths to construct my own mind. I had come to believe that the ability to evaluate many ideas, many histories, and many points of view was at the heart of what it means to self-create." This quote is important for what we're going to talk about today, because we're going to talk about the origins and impact of a specific belief, about a specific incident called Ruby Ridge, which the author is going to talk about in the first chapter of this book today. So we're going to read the prologue and chapter 1. We're going to talk about this incident called Ruby Ridge and what Tara believes about it and why it matters. And we're doing all of this so that at the end of this unit we can write up an essay about our own beliefs. So hopefully you can make some connections between your own beliefs and Tara's beliefs and start to look at sort of the origins of some of the things that we believe. As we read this book, I'm going to have you guys fill out this belief tracker. And I've got this in Canvas. You don't have to print it off of here. I want you to print it off of Canvas. And I want you to fill it out as we read. So you'll see that I've made 4 different columns. There's a column for you to write down beliefs held by Tara's father. And then I want you to write down Tara's belief on the same subject. And this is going to be kind of tricky because she's telling the story as an adult about experiences as a child. So she has certain beliefs as a child that her perspective changes on as she ages. And so you can write down both of those beliefs of Tara's. You can write down just what she believes at the time or what she believes as an adult. Any of those will be acceptable. And then sometimes you'll see other characters doing small, subtle things or saying things that indicate they have a different belief. And when you see that happening, I want you to write that down right here in the beliefs of other characters in the book. And then I want you to write down your belief on this subject. So I filled out a few ideas to get you started. I want you to write down, what does Tara's father seem to believe about education? What does he believe about the government? What does he believe about medicine? What does he believe about women's roles? What does he believe about work? And then there's a whole entire page of blanks for you to fill out yourself about different topics, because you're going to see a lot of beliefs in this book. So that's the first task I have for you. You're going to use this to write your essay at the end, so don't lose it. Make sure you have it in class with you every day. Print it out. It's probably easier to print it out than try to do it online. And then the second paper that you're going to print out that you're going to keep with you every day is this character sheet. And I'm going to put this in Canvas also. You don't access it from this slideshow. I'm just putting it up here so you know what it looks like. It's called Educated Character Tracker. Because there's going to be a lot of characters in this book, and I think it's important that you understand who they are so you can keep track of the plot. Okay? So, in the prologue, Tara Westover is going to talk about her home called Buck's Peak. And Buck's Peak, this is Buck's Peak. It's really a symbol in this book of Tara's home and everything that she finds familiar and comforting. And so she's going to talk about Buck's Peak in the prologue but really she's kind of foreshadowing larger things. And when she talks about Buck's Peak, she tells this story. Her dad has a belief about Buck's Peak, a story about Buck's Peak. And when I read it, I immediately started relating to this story because I've heard the exact same story about Timpanogos. The legend of Mount Timpanogos is that there was an Indian princess who fell in love with a god named Red Eagle, and there are different variations about what happened between the Indian princess Utana and Red Eagle. And Utana ends up basically making herself a human sacrifice to the gods. If you've ever been inside Timpanogos Cave, there's this giant stalactite, and they say that it's Princess Utana's heart and Red Eagle's heart combined. And they say that Timpanogos is the profile of Princess Utana laying down. I'm not really sure I can explain it accurately, but I think her face is about right here, and then her arms are right here, and she's got her arms crossed over her chest, and then her legs, and then these are her feet down here. I think. I don't know. Anyway, if you care about the story, you can read it on the Timpanogos Cave Monument webpage. I feel like this was significant to me because I feel like, we have the same kind of stories about our homes, and it made me really relate to this book a lot. So that's going to be the prologue. The first chapter, chapter 1, is going to be about a memory that's not actually a memory. And this is an important, significant thing that Tara Westover says is her earliest memory. And she talks about an incident called the Ruby Ridge Massacre. And this is what I want you guys to be thinking about today. What are the origins of Tara's belief about Ruby Ridge, and what is the impact of her beliefs about Ruby Ridge? How does this story about Ruby Ridge impact her perception of herself? And I love that we're talking about this right now because actually, I don't know if you guys remember last week when I was absent, I told you that there was a SWAT team in my neighborhood, and the reason why this SWAT team was in my neighborhood actually has some similarities and origins in the Ruby Ridge Massacre. There's a man apparently in my neighborhood who owes about $1 million in back taxes. He hasn't paid taxes since 1999, and so his home was repossessed by the government, but he was illegally occupied. So he was supposed to move out in July, and they kicked him out once, and he came back and he was illegally occupying his home, and he had made some statements about how he wouldn't leave his home without a fight, and there was a very famous government protester named Ammon Bundy Ammon Bundy in 2016 was part of a standoff with police in Oregon. He and his friends and family held a ranger station for I think about 3 weeks. They took over a national park ranger station and occupied it with like a full militia, weapons and guns, and they were surrounded the whole time by SWAT teams trying to get them to abandon the ranger station. Anyway, apparently Ammon Bundy was in my neighborhood all last week, pacing around this house with weapons, and they had made some statements saying they weren't going to leave without a fight. And so then 2 SWAT teams and 2 helicopters came into my neighborhood to try to repossess this house and get my neighbor out of the house, and they didn't know how it was going to go down because of statements he'd made. And I feel like I'm going to play for you this video, this documentary about the Ruby Ridge Massacre, and you'll see, I think, some similarities between the Ruby Ridge Massacre and what just happened in my neighborhood last week. So Tara's also going to talk about the Ruby Ridge Massacre, and I want you to kind of compare this version that I'm about to show you with the version that Tara gives you and see if you can find any differences and similarities.
A standoff between a man who was wanted by the FBI and a large... Number of federal agents
surrounding a cabin where a fugitive named Randy Weaver is holed up with his family.
In 1992, a bloody standoff between lawmen and an armed white separatist named Randy Weaver left his wife, 14-year-old son, and a federal agent dead.
The 11-day siege at a place called Ruby Ridge, Idaho. It happened before Waco, and for many, it's an even bigger rallying cry.
I want the truth!
You've got the OK Corral. You've got certain moments in the history of American law enforcement where society says, wait a minute, we got to take a look at this in a different way. Ruby Ridge began a paradigm shift.
Inadequate performance.
Ruby Ridge shook the highest ranks of the FBI, and it remains a watchword wherever law enforcement stands off against barricaded suspects today.
This story is used as what not to do. That gives me hope. Maybe we won't make the same mistakes. Maybe we won't rush into things when it's a matter of life or death. I thought they were chasing down a moose or a bear or something. Honestly, I had no clue that there were people with guns in the woods that day.
16-year-old Sarah Weaver was in her family's remote Idaho cabin when their dog ran into the woods barking. Her father, Randy Weaver, a family friend, and her 14-year-old brother Sam followed with their rifles. The next thing she heard was an explosion of gunfire.
Everything in me wanted to run down the hill and try and, protect my brother, because I knew he was down there, and I'd always been his big sister. I'd always been his protector. So there's part of me that just wanted to take off down the driveway and make sure he was okay.
Torn, she stayed with her mother and younger sisters until the friend, Kevin Harris, returned.
He said that Sam was gone, and I think my whole world fell apart at that moment. None of us at that time were thinking that anything worse could happen.
But unbeknownst to Sarah, U.S. Marshals had been staking out her parents, who were vehemently anti-government, for months. Her father had fled charges of selling 2 illegal shotguns, and her mother had indicated they wouldn't surrender without a fight. When the dog uncovered the Marshals' location, an agent shot it, and a gunfight ensued that killed 14-year-old Sam Weaver and a deputy U.S. Marshal named William Deegan.
I can't speak for everybody on my team, but I assumed I was walking into a violent situation. There's likely to be a shootout.
Scores of federal agents quickly descended the next morning. As sharpshooters like Chris Whitcomb took position around the cabin, they were under an unusual order. If any adult male is observed with a weapon, deadly force can and should be employed.
The entire world, for someone in my position at that time, is this big around. You don't see the larger circumstances. You don't see the larger picture. You just see the world through a scope.
Dad was wanting to go see Sam one more time and just, I guess, do some more grieving, say goodbye, I don't know. And so I took off after him, and he made it around the shed ahead of me. The
people that I saw with assault rifles were moving from tree to building to wood pile through fog. I didn't have the shot. My finger was on the trigger. I was trying to take the shot. I didn't have it.
I just heard a giant boom. I said, Dad, what happened? And he said, I've been shot. And, at this point, my mom had stepped out of the door, and she was screaming, what happened, and get in the house. And we all get piled up in front of the door, and I hear what is like a gunshot going off in my ear. And Mom just drops to my side. I knew what had happened to her immediately. I thought it was the end for all of us at that point.
Sarah's mother, Vicky, took a fatal shot to the head as she held the family's 10-month-old baby in her arms. But outside the cabin, no one was aware Vicky was dead, and agents kept trying to negotiate with her.
When they got on the bullhorn and started asking for Mom to come out and have pancakes for breakfast with her kids, and wouldn't you want to do that with your children, sort of thing. It it's a cliche to say it added insult to injury, but it did.
As news of the standoff spread, journalists converged on the scene.
2 people have already died. Neither side seems ready to back down.
The FBI says they will not leave until Weaver and his friend Kevin Harris, who lives with him, are in custody.
Everyone here in Naples agrees that Weaver is a white supremacist who just wants to be left alone. For police, he is a fugitive on a federal arms charge, heavily armed and dangerous.
And a small army of right-wing sympathizers also gathered on the road below the cabin to protest. The Weavers held out for a total of 11 days. After Vicky was shot, they believed they'd be killed if they stepped outside. The standoff ended only after Bo Greitz, a right-wing presidential candidate sympathetic to the Weavers' cause, negotiated a surrender.
Our camera caught a glimpse of the family walking into the staging area. One of the girls is wearing a red jacket at the bottom of your screen.
When I got to the meadow, it was a scene out of a movie. It was inconceivable to me to think that they would need so much and so many people and tanks and helicopters.
All this for one family.
The story was dramatized in a TV movie and folk songs, and it found a ready-made audience.
The Ruby Ridge standoff became a kind of founding myth of the radical right. It not only made the government look bad, it was bad. People, whatever views they have, whatever illegal activities they have, should not be shot down by government snipers when they are not actively threatening the life of somebody.
Later investigations revealed that law enforcement had made a series of errors. Authorities on the ground communicated poorly with agents arriving from afar, which exaggerated the threat Weaver posed, and agents on the scene failed to negotiate or set up a clear line of communication with the family until it was too late. In the end, jurors decided Randy Weaver's most serious crime was failing to appear in court. And then came accusations that the FBI had attempted to cover up its mistakes.
The FBI is feeling the heat.
During Weaver's 1993 trial, another FBI standoff ended in tragedy and accusations of misconduct. 76 members of the Branch Davidian religious sect died in a federal raid on their compound in Waco, Texas.
There are eerie parallels with Waco. In both cases, government miscalculation in the arrest of a fanatic ended in gunfire and death.
The radical right views itself as being in a battle to the death with the federal government. Ruby Ridge, for them, was the opening shot of that war.
Critics complain there was no real investigation and no real punishment after the 1992 incident. It's now clear their voices have been heard.
Amid intense federal scrutiny of the Ruby Ridge scandal, the FBI's number 2 man was demoted, 3 other agents were suspended, and 1 was sent to jail. And the Weaver family won a $3.1 million settlement from the federal government.
Law enforcement typically changes not because someone has a brilliant idea. We change because we're sued or there's public opinion that speaks against us. And we realized we had to change. We had to do this better.
Since the early 1990s, the FBI says it's overhauled how it responds to armed standoffs and trained hundreds of police departments across the country. The federal deadly force policy can't be modified on the fly, as it was at Ruby Ridge.
Basically, throw us a bomb?
Yeah. You gotta help me help you.
Yeah.
And agents now trained to set up better communication on the scene.
Organizationally, we've changed, right? So the negotiators are fully embedded within our tactical section.
All right, so shield, cover.
If you can slow things down and negotiate and peacefully communicate with the subjects and try to figure out what's motivating them, then you should take full advantage.
Can you hear me in the bus? This is Katie with the FBI. I want to talk to you about how we're going to get the phone to you.
You get involved in a shootout situation in America today, it's going to be litigated for years. We look at things differently now. We look and say, time is not the issue it once was.
Take the case of John Joe Gray in East Texas. 7 years after Ruby Ridge, Gray was stopped for a traffic violation and got into a fight with a state trooper and bit him. He then retreated to his farm with his weapons and refused to come out.
John Joe Gray.
How you doing?
A 51-year-old self-proclaimed freedom fighter.
What'll happen if they try to raid this place?
And come out after us, bring extra body bags.
But local law enforcement made a unique decision. They decided not to raid his compound to bring him to court.
You look at things like Waco, you look at things like Ruby Ridge, and I'm not sure that it is worth going out there and taking that chance.
Henderson County Sheriff Ray Nutt is the fourth sheriff who's decided not to storm Gray's compound since the standoff began, and that's given this case a special status.
Often it's called the longest running standoff in American history.
He's been under self-imposed house arrest for 14 years. The longest term in prison I could have given him was 10. I probably wouldn't have given him 10.
That doesn't satisfy Gray's former son-in-law, who watched his ex-wife take their 2 children into the compound and then disappear. Gray refused to talk on camera, but claimed he'll stay put indefinitely, living off the land and occasional help from a few supporters. If the police do come, he told us, I ain't going down without a fight. So far, the battle has remained oddly one-sided.
This is more of, a lounge off, because everybody's just kind of chilled into what it is. This isn't going to end until John Joe Gray passes on.
It's not a perfect outcome to have somebody thumbing their nose at a lawful court order, but in the respect that nobody was killed, it's an acceptable outcome for me.
In the 2 decades since Ruby Ridge, Sarah Weaver bought a small acreage in Montana with a portion of the settlement money, distanced herself from her father's beliefs, and made peace with the past.
It's not easy being a Christian. Forgiveness is an ongoing choice and an ongoing process. I'm forgiving the people that showed up with tanks and guns and armored personnel carriers, and I'm forgiving the ones that pulled the trigger. I'm forgiving the ones that sent the orders. Forgiveness is not saying what happened is okay, because I believe if we forget those mistakes, they can be repeated.
All right, so that's the Ruby Ridge Massacre. Basically, Randy Weaver was accused of selling some sawed-off shotguns, and he was going to get arrested and go to trial. But he said, if you come to arrest me, I will fight you. I have guns. His wife said, we won't go down without a fight. And so when the police had been watching him because he and his wife were making anti-government statements and selling sawed-off shotguns. And so on this morning, they were hiding in the woods around his house, preparing to possibly arrest him for selling these sawed-off shotguns. And a dog came out and found them. And so they shot the dog because they were hiding. And then Randy Weaver's 14-year-old son came to investigate, and they shot the son. And then Randy Weaver returned fire, and so they basically were in a shootout. Randy Weaver and his friend retreated to the cabin, and then I think about 2 days later, they had laid out his son's body in a shed, and he went back to the shed to visit his son and say goodbye. And when he opened the door, there was another shootout that killed his wife. So it was a tragic situation, and there was a lot of scrutiny about the way federal authorities had handled this. And Tara Westover is going to talk about her memories of this historic event in the first chapter here. I want you to compare what you've just learned about this event with her father's version of the same event. And I want you to be thinking about the overall impact that this event had on Tara Westover's life for years moving forward. Then in Canvas, there are going to be 6 questions that I want you to answer in about 3 sentences each. And they are, explain what Tara's father believes about the Randy Weaver family and the Ruby Ridge Massacre. What do you believe based on the information that you just got about the Ruby Ridge Massacre? There's a quote at about 3 minutes and 30 seconds into the video I just showed you. where the former FBI agent who was there, one of the ones who initiated the shooting, says, "The entire world, for someone in my position at that time, is this big around. You didn't see the larger circumstances. You don't see the larger picture. You just see the world through a telescope." I want you to explain what you think he means. I think that this quote has some significance and relevance to the quote up here that Tara Westover gives us, where she talks about how she needed to see and experience more truths than the ones that had been offered to her and make up her own mind. Maybe you can, in this question here, question 3, explain the connection between those two quotes or the relevance of those two quotes. Tell me what you think the sheriff means when he says that. Then question 4 is, I want you to tell me how Tara's father's beliefs about Ruby Ridge influenced Tara going forward. She talks about this in the chapter, or you can infer it from the chapter. And then also, he has some interesting beliefs about milk. And there are some places where you can see other members of the family agreeing or disagreeing with him. So I want you to add that, answer that question here, add it to your beliefs tracker. And then I want you to explain to me, why doesn't Tara go with her grandma to Arizona? This is a significant moment where Tara's grandmother invites her to go to Arizona to get an education. And Tara chooses not to go. Tell me why. You're going to have to infer. The answers aren't going to be told to you in the chapter. I want you to use evidence to make an educated guess. So answer these questions in Canvas, and I can't wait to talk about them with you guys.